Imagine the glare of spotlights, the glint of a crown, the solemnity of official portraits. Now, forget all of it. Behind the velvet curtain of the official chronicle lies a story that few dared to even whisper. This is the tale of a monarch whose true power extended far beyond the throne room into the dimly lit private cinemas of the elite, where the most audacious fantasies flickered to life on screen. King Alfonso XIII, the last knight of Europe, spent his days signing laws and his nights poring over film reels that could have brought his empire crashing down, all with a gambler's zeal. This story is not a mere catalog of palace intrigues and salacious rumors. It is a journey into the mind of a man who was born a king but yearned to be someone else, perhaps the grand director of the forbidden. We will reveal how a desperate love turned to ash, how a family tragedy fueled his secret passions, and how the motion picture camera became the only mirror in which he was not afraid to see his true self. Prepare yourselves, for tonight we strip the gilding from the legend to show you not a monarch, but a man in all his brilliance, his vice, and his solitude. To understand this hurricane of passions, we must return to the very beginning, to the day he was born into the world. Alfonso XIII was born in 1886, already a king, literally. His father had passed away before his birth, and so the infant, having barely drawn his first breath, was met not with a cradle, but with a crown and a throne. Picture the scene: a child whose youth should have been filled with games and fairy tales was, from the moment he was swaddled, thrust into the merciless theater of court protocol. His life was a paradox from the start, a gilded cage where every step was choreographed and every glance was judged. The upbringing of this unusual monarch fell to his mother, the Queen Regent Maria Christina. An Austrian by blood and a devout Catholic with a will as unyielding as Alpine granite, she saw her son not as a child, but as a project. Her goal was to sculpt him into the ideal Christian sovereign, a living icon of piety and duty. But the tighter she squeezed the vice of discipline, the more fiercely the rebel within him awoke. Court etiquette taught him how to wear a mask, but it never taught him how to control his desires. In the end, all the energy suppressed in public erupted in his private life with tripled force. It became clear even in his youth that his mother's project had been a spectacular failure. The young Alfonso displayed an insatiable curiosity for life beyond the palace walls, and especially for its fairer half. While his tutors read him treatises on morality, he was already embarking on his first love affairs, breaking every conceivable rule. The palace staff, those invisible witnesses to all royal secrets, began to whisper about the little rake with the crown. That whisper was the harbinger of a coming storm, one that would soon engulf not only his family, but all of Spain. In 1906, in search of a political alliance and an heir, Alfonso XIII turned his gaze to the misty Isle of Great Britain. His chosen bride was a British aristocrat, Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, granddaughter of the formidable Queen Victoria herself. She was just 18, an English rose carelessly transplanted into the scorched Spanish earth. Reserved, raised in strict tradition, she looked to the future with apprehension, knowing she was entering a world where everything was alien. The language, the customs, even the smiles. She saw in her future husband a charming but volatile man, the very embodiment of Spanish temperament. But her fragile dreams of marital bliss were doomed from the start. Their union began not with celebratory fireworks, but with a deafening explosion. On their wedding day, as the newlyweds' carriage processed through the streets of Madrid, an anarchist hurled a bomb at them. The fiery blast claimed the lives of 24 people, but the king and queen, by some miracle, were unharmed. This bloody episode became a sinister prophecy, a dark symbol of the life they would lead together, publicly brilliant, yet privately riddled with pain and tragedy. Spain welcomed its new queen not with applause, but with the roar of a terrorist attack, and that sound would haunt her for the rest of her days. Soon, the external threats were replaced by an internal one, a far more terrifying affliction. The marriage produced 7 children, but for Alfonso, the joy of fatherhood was poisoned. 3 of his sons suffered from hemophilia, the hereditary disease that could turn a simple scratch into a fatal wound. This royal disease was the dark legacy that Victoria Eugenie, through her famous grandmother, had brought into the House of Bourbon. For Alfonso, obsessed with the idea of a strong dynasty, this felt like a personal insult, a betrayal. He was furious, convinced his wife had hidden the truth from him, foisting tainted blood upon his lineage. His shouts echoed through the palace corridors, turning the royal apartments into a battleground. Each new misfortune drove another nail into the coffin of their marriage. Their eldest son, the heir apparent, renounced the throne for the love of a commoner. Their second son, Jaime, was left deaf after a botched surgery. The other children, too, were not blessed with robust health. The constant fear for her sons' lives and the cold fury of her husband finally broke Victoria Eugenie. She retreated into herself, dedicating her life to religion and charity, while Alfonso sought solace in the arms of other women. Their relationship became an icy desert. Contemporaries recalled that one day, in a moment of despair, the queen hurled a phrase at her husband that marked the point of no return. "I never want to see your hideous face again." From that moment on, they were strangers living under the same roof. At official functions, they continued to play the part of the perfect couple. But in the palace, they resided on different floors, like neighbors bound only by a shared surname and a shared pain. Victoria Eugenie felt like a prisoner in her gilded cage, while Alfonso transformed the royal court into a stage for his endless pleasures, intrigues, and carnal escapades. Divorce was unthinkable. All that was left for them was to exist in this quiet, polite hell. Готовы ли вы ко второй части, где мы погрузимся в теневую империю короля и его истинную тайную страсть – кинематограф? Part 2 of 3, The Shadow Empire and the Dream Factory. While icy drafts swept through the empty corridors of the official residence, Alfonso was building his own shadow empire, a kingdom of the flesh and fleeting pleasures. Even during his lifetime, his amorous exploits were so shrouded in rumor and legend that it became nearly impossible to separate fact from fiction. This was not mere flirtation or a series of casual affairs. It was a meticulously constructed system, a parallel universe where he was not just a monarch, but a deity demanding constant tribute. His appetites were boundless, and his collection of hearts, whether broken or bought, could have filled an entire museum. He turned Madrid and Barcelona into his personal hunting grounds, where every beautiful actress, every talented singer, and every daring dancer knew that sooner or later an elegant gentleman would knock on her dressing room door with an offer that could not be refused. It was a veritable harem, scattered across secret apartments and lavish villas, all maintained at the treasury's expense. This world had its own laws, its own favorites, and its own outcasts. Women came and went with kaleidoscopic speed, but the system operated flawlessly. He was a known figure in every establishment of ill repute, from expensive cabarets to cheap brothels, where his clandestine appearances inspired both fear and awe. For these purposes, he maintained several secret residences, true nests of debauchery, where women were brought under the cover of night for private audiences. All of this required a vast network of confidants, secretaries, drivers, and bodyguards who were not merely servants, but guardians of the kingdom's most explosive secret. They provided his alibis, paid off blackmailers, and managed the delicate problems that inevitably arose in such a whirlwind of passion. Yet, even in this endless stream of faces, there was one woman who managed to become more than just another plaything. She became the great love of his life. Her name was Carmen Ruíz Moragas. She was a theater actress whose beauty was as dazzling as her intellect. Unlike the hundreds of others, she possessed not only a captivating appearance, but also a sharp wit, an independent spirit, and a character that would not allow her to be a mere submissive shadow. She was his intellectual equal, a woman with whom he could not only spend the night, but also talk until dawn. Their connection was as public as it could possibly be under the circumstances. Carmen became the unofficial Queen of Spain, its de facto First Lady. She bore Alfonso 2 children, a son and a daughter, whom he adored but never officially acknowledged. Despite this, he provided them with a life of luxury and privilege. Carmen lived in a magnificent mansion. Her children attended the finest private schools in Europe, and she herself moved in high society, where everyone knew her status but pretended to notice nothing. This double life was a perfect reflection of the era, an age of hypocrisy, where the facade mattered far more than the truth. Queen Victoria Eugenie was fading away in her solitude, while the king's mistress shone at receptions, setting the trends in fashion and art. But the 2 children with Carmen were just the tip of the iceberg. Persistent rumors held that Alfonso had at least 4 other illegitimate offspring by various women. All were raised and supported by the state, but their origins were carefully concealed. This was his secret dynasty, scattered across the country. Sometimes, on the streets of Madrid, one might spot elegantly dressed young men whose family resemblance to the monarch was simply astonishing. They were invariably accompanied by inconspicuous men with a military bearing, palace guards. The city's residents, seeing this scene, would exchange knowing whispers. "Look, there goes another one of his bastards." These living reminders of the king's escapades were a constant source of gossip and a silent reproach to his official family. The story of these forgotten children is a separate drama in itself. They grew up knowing who their father was, but without the right to bear his name. Their lives were comfortable, yet they lacked the one thing that mattered most: recognition. However, time occasionally sets things right. Decades later, in 2003, the 74-year-old son of Carmen and Alfonso Leandro, achieved the nearly impossible. After a lengthy court battle, he won the legal right from the Spanish judiciary for himself and his late sister to use the surname Bourbon. Thus, one of the ghosts of the past finally gained a name, providing documentary proof of what all of Spain had whispered about for nearly a century. Yet all these endless affairs and secret families were merely a prelude, a smokescreen hiding his true, all-consuming passion. Alfonso XIII was not simply a collector of women's bodies. He was drawn to something more. His true calling was art, specifically its most forbidden, carnal, and transgressive form. He was a secret director, a voyeur with a crown who had found the perfect tool to realize his fantasies: the cinema. While the world saw motion pictures as little more than cheap fairground entertainment, he recognized their immense power to capture and multiply forbidden pleasure. His interest in physical intimacy transformed into an obsession with its aesthetics, its staging, its drama. He wanted not just to possess, but to direct, to observe, and to rewatch, becoming the master not only of bodies, but of their images captured on film. And so, in 1915, as Europe burned in the fires of the First World War, something entirely different was being born in neutral Spain. With the full support of his inner circle, Alfonso XIII founded his own film studio, Royal Films. On paper, everything looked perfectly respectable. The company was to produce short newsreels, documentaries about the royal family, and patriotic features. It was the perfect cover, a respectable facade for what was, in reality, a production line churning out risqué films for exclusive, internal palace use. The king was not merely a sponsor of this enterprise, he was its heart and soul. With the energy of an obsessed genius, he personally oversaw every stage of production. He conceived the scenarios, approved the actresses, and selected the props and sets with an artist's meticulous eye. This was his secret kingdom, his personal dream factory, where he could finally be himself, free from the mask of a monarch and the head of a Catholic state. The stories born from Alfonso's imagination speak volumes about his inner world. He was particularly drawn to scripts that balanced on the edge of sacrilege, where the spiritual collided with the carnal. One of his favorite themes was the temptation of the clergy. Imagine one such film, titled The Confessor, in which a young nun comes to confession and begins to seduce her priest. In another, young women would visit a doctor with unambiguous complaints, turning the medical office into a stage for explicit vignettes. The king was a true connoisseur of the female form, and his personal preferences directly influenced the casting. His favored type was actresses with very large busts, a fact repeatedly confirmed in descriptions of the films and the surviving letters of his confidants. The films themselves were a product of their time, black and white, silent, and without title cards, but they were distinguished by surprisingly detailed staging, quality cinematography, and even elements of black humor, betraying a creator with a very particular taste. The screenings of these works were a highly classified ritual, accessible only to a select few. A makeshift cinema was set up in the palace specifically for this purpose, where the king, in the company of his closest friends, would enjoy the fruits of his secret labors. Sometimes, for a change of scenery, the viewings were held in the cellars of Madrid bars, accessible only by personal invitation from the monarch himself. The atmosphere was fitting. Loyal bodyguards stood at the entrance, turning away any uninvited guests, while inside, amidst clouds of cigar smoke, forbidden images flickered to life on a white sheet. This was a private club, a secret society, where the king could cast off the burden of power and etiquette. In total, some 70 such films were produced under the Royal Films banner, an entire underground filmography that seemed destined to vanish forever, along with its creator. Готовы к финалу. В последней части мы увидим падение и изгнание короля, ироничную судьбу его коллекции и подведем итоги его противоречивой жизни. Part 3 of 3, The Final Act and a Celluloid Ghost. The end of this convoluted and scandalous life was as ambiguous as his entire reign. If, in his youth, Alfonso XIII had dazzled the court, dispensing smiles and generous promises, he met his old age in exile, without a throne, without a wife, without the respect of his people, and, most ironically, without access to his beloved film studio. The wheel of fortune, which had spun in his favor for so long, took its final crushing turn. The man who had spent his life directing the fates of others and his own pleasures found himself a mere extra in a grand historical drama, where the leading role was no longer played by a monarchy, but by a republic. The final act of his life was written without his input, and its sets were drab and foreign. Everything collapsed in a single day, April 14th, 1931. Municipal elections, expected to be a mere formality, resulted in a landslide victory for the Republicans. The air in Spain crackled with the premonition of change. Alfonso understood his time was up. He could have tried to cling to power by force, to unleash the army to suppress the popular unrest, but that would have meant plunging the country into the chaos of civil war. And so, he made what was perhaps the only truly noble decision of his life. To avoid bloodshed, as the official statement read, he voluntarily left the country. In reality, he fled, leaving an unsigned abdication on his desk, as if hoping to one day return. But this was a one-way ticket. The last 10 years of his life were spent wandering, transformed from an all-powerful monarch into a ghost of the past. First Paris, then Rome. Cities that had once welcomed him as an honored guest now regarded him with cold indifference. His days were devoid of glamour, power, and women. Queen Victoria Eugenie, from whom he had long been estranged, had found refuge in Switzerland, severing even their formal ties for good. His relationships with his children were strained and cool, their own lives, filled with tragedy and disappointment, were bound to other countries and other concerns. He found himself in a total vacuum, surrounded only by memories of his former greatness, which now seemed like scenes from a long-forgotten film. His financial situation was catastrophic. Part of his vast fortune had been confiscated by the Republican government, while the rest had slipped through his fingers like sand, spent on supporting his illegitimate children, numerous mistresses, and decades of unrestrained indulgence. The king, who had spent millions on his secret film projects, was now counting every lira. He spent his final months in a room at the Grand Hotel in Rome, practically destitute. His health deteriorated rapidly. Old injuries from car accidents flared up. His heart began to fail, and his soul was consumed by depression. In January 1941, sensing the end was near, he made his final political gesture. He officially renounced his rights to the Spanish throne in favor of his third son, Juan. But he, too, was not destined to be king. History had other plans. Alfonso XIII passed away on February 28, 1941, at the age of just 54. His death was quiet and unnoticed, a stark contrast to the loud and vibrant life he had led. At his side were only a doctor, a chaplain, and a few loyal servants. No wife, no children. Official Spain, preoccupied with its own internal strife, ignored his passing. The monarchy seemed a distant, almost forgotten past. His body was first interred in Rome, in the modest crypt of a church. It seemed as though history had definitively struck his name from its annals, leaving his remains in a foreign land. But history has a way of coming full circle. Nearly 40 years passed. The Franco regime fell, the monarchy was restored in Spain, and his grandson Juan Carlos I ascended to the throne. It was then, in 1980, that the decision was made to return the exiled king's remains to his homeland. His ashes were transported to Spain with full honors and reinterred in the pantheon of the kings at El Escorial, the majestic crypt where all of Spain's great monarchs rest. History, like a wise and forgiving judge, had decided that despite all the orgies, scandals, and forbidden films, he had earned his place among his ancestors. The libertine, the director, the exile, he had returned home to become a permanent part of the very official chronicle he had so fiercely fled his entire life. So who was he, really, this last bourbon on the Spanish throne? History has left us two portraits of him, and they contradict each other like light and shadow. One is official, the monarch on postage stamps, the father of the nation in a dress uniform, a figure from textbooks. The other is clandestine, captured not on canvas but on fragile celluloid film, a director of his own vices, an architect of forbidden worlds, a man who desperately tried to escape from himself in a labyrinth of other people's bodies. His entire life was a performance played out from two different scripts simultaneously. In one, he played the role of king, a part forced upon him at birth. In the other, he was the author, creating a reality where there was no duty, no dynasty, no God, only a camera, a woman, and a fleeting moment of oblivion. Perhaps his secret film studio was not merely the whim of a jaded aristocrat. Perhaps it was his only form of therapy, a desperate attempt to fill the gaping void in his soul. When your home becomes a mausoleum of unfulfilled hopes, when your wife is a stranger and your children are a constant reminder of your blood's curse, where do you run? Alfonso ran into a world of illusions that he could control. On screen, he was omnipotent. He could create passion where his life held only coldness, direct an intimacy he was denied, and turn his pain into a grotesque farce. His dream factory was built on the ruins of his family's happiness, and every frame shot in the twilight of his studio was an echo of his own loneliness. What remains of such a life? Looking back at his fate today, from the vantage point of a century, it is easy to condemn him as a degenerate and an egoist. But perhaps his story is something more. It is the tragedy of a man crushed by the weight of a crown, who never learned to be a good husband or a good father because he was never taught how to simply be a man. He was the last king of a fading era, and his fall was not only political, but deeply personal. He never found his place in the world, caught between the throne and the editing table, between duty and desire. And in the end, he lost them both. And today, as his ashes lie in the cold marble of El Escorial, beside his great and pious ancestors, his true spirit lives on elsewhere. It lives not in the official chronicles or in lavish epitaphs. His ghost still flickers there on those 3 miraculously preserved film reels in the naive and audacious scenes he created. It is there, in that shadow cinema, that the real Alfonso XIII is hidden, not a king, but the director of his own emptiness, whose greatest masterpiece was his own ultimately misunderstood life.